change your quantity in your market, then yeah, I could only say it just increases the total quantity in the market. Yes, in that sense, it affects the other firms of decision making.
Well, the key thing is that there's no price effect, right? Because all the other firms are keeping their prices fixed in differentiated product Nash prices, right? And therefore, any externalities across firms have to be real rather than pecuniary, because they can only affect the other firm's quantities, right? Yeah,
so
Andre.
Can you change your price, and can't you consider that it's a relative price change, and then the demand changes?
Well, I mean, it's not really a relative. There's no, in a quasi-linear model, which is what we're thinking about, which is the only time in which it makes sense to talk about pecuniary versus real externalities in many ways. There's no such thing as a relative price change. So it's just, you're just lowering the price and thereby changing the quantities of other firms. Yeah, Jim.
So it seems like then the central question is whether firms are competing Cornell or Bertrand, because that would determine whether the externality is like bad or okay, right?
Yeah, so we'll see lots more about that. There's many different ways of formulating things that will affect how much of the externalities that you have are each of these. Now, these are two sort of extreme types.
Right.
But one thing to notice is that quantities always are going to be too low under Cornell, because you have this, whenever I lower my quantity, I'm getting one side of an externality from the consumers, and all externalities on all other firms are purely pecuniary, so those just don't matter from society's perspective, right? Whereas under differentiated products, Nash prices, it's not obvious, actually, that my, well, actually, Chrissy, what do you think? Is it obvious under differentiated product Nash prices that quantities are going to be too low?
No, they can be too high.
Yeah.
I mean, we can have, like, above essentially optimal.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about that below, because the real externalities that you cause on other firms might outweigh or more than outweigh the real externalities you cause on consumers, right? Regardless of which case we're talking about, when goods are substitutes, my lowering my quantity or raising my price always benefits my competitor. And in fact, we can define the notion of firms being substitutes exactly by this, right? Now, if firms act in such a way as to internalize the real or pecuniary externalities between them, Daiichi, what do we say that they're doing?
Colluding.
Yeah, exactly. Colluding is the case in which firms internalize pecuniary or real externalities among them. And those are going to be worse if the externalities that they're internalizing are pecuniary externalities, rather than if they're real externalities, because we know pecuniary externalities shouldn't be internalized, right? So these were, this sort of collusion, this sort of internalization of these externalities that shouldn't be internalized were denounced by Adam Smith famously in the quote that's in your syllabus, and were made illegal in the United States under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the way that this happened was that in the 19th century, there were all these companies that were getting very big. They were cartelizing industries. This was making a lot of people angry. It was hurting a lot of consumers. And there was this group movement called the Progressive Movement that sort of lobbied for these things to be made illegal. And they used a lot of cartoons like this. So if you guys have ever seen the octopus in my office, the reason I have it there is it's as a representative of like the monopoly that I study in my work. This is a picture in particular of Standard Oil, which was founded by John Rockefeller, who gave the money for this university. Therefore, the octopus is called Rocky. Anyway, so once upon a time, cartel agreements were actually legally enforceable. And that was true in the United States prior to the Sherman Act. And actually, it took a long time for other countries to adopt antitrust policy like the United States has. Now, tons of countries have it. But in continental Europe, prior to the early 1980s, cartel agreements were actually enforceable. And these types of cartel agreements are technically illegal in many developing countries, but are never, there's really no enforcement of them being illegal. So in practice, you can actually write cartel agreements. Britain was actually the first country to make cartel agreements illegal. They did that back in the 18th century, thanks to the influence of people like Smith and other early economists. Now, the United States basically leads the world in enforcement, and it makes illegal explicit agreements about prices and services among firms that are competitors that sell substitute goods. And we'll see later on in the course that it's quite different, the analysis among producers of complementary goods. Even without communication that's explicit or any explicit agreement, firms can be prosecuted for what's called tacit collusion if there's strong enough evidence that they were somehow, without explicitly communicating, tacitly agreeing to set a price, though in practice it's so hard to prove cases like that that they're very uncommon. A third, this stuff is punished by either jail time for the people who are involved or by civil penalties for the firms, and often by both. And because it's hard to detect collusion like this, the US has an institution called treble damages, where you actually have to pay 3 times the harms that were caused by the collusion when you're caught, because it's thought that the probability of you getting caught is only about 1 in 3. So that makes the expected payment that you make equal to the harm that you caused. Now, these laws create many practical challenges in running a cartel nowadays, and that makes collusion difficult and therefore only possible in limited settings. So the basic problem is that while the cartel benefits all the members of the industry, each individual firm has an incentive to just let the other firms form a cartel and to itself betray the cartel. And Eric, why does each individual firm have an incentive to betray the cartel?
Well, I mean, it depends on the situation, but basically the firm knows how everyone else is going to act and like whatever the agreement is, and they can like figure out how to abuse that.
Well, but in particular, why is it going to be attractive for the firm to like let other people form a cartel and not obey it itself?
Because the other people will be restricting their production, you know, in an attempt to extract the cartel.
Yeah.
Or whatever, and if they're behaving competitively against that, then
exactly. If the more that other firms raise the price, the more that you get from making an additional sale, right? And the more incentive you have to betray the agreement. In fact, the more that we're internalizing externalities across firms, the more that inherently it has to be the case that I'm going to have an incentive to not internalize those externalities. What an externality means is it's something that in the absence of some sort of an agreement, I wouldn't want to take into account, right? And so the more that we're doing that, the more I have an incentive to unilaterally defect, right? And in fact, the more ambitious a cartel is, the less stable it will be, because the higher the prices, the more incentive I have on the margin to betray and increase my quantity, right? So what that means is that the extent of collusion that's possible is basically equal to the ability that we have to deter people from cheating. If we only have a little bit of ability to deter people from cheating, there will be a little bit of collusion. If we have a lot of ability to deter people from cheating, then there will be a lot of collusion that's possible, right? And basically, policy related to cartels is all about the interplay between the cartel's ability to punish defectors from the cartel and the government's ability to punish people for not defecting from the cartel, right? Or to punish the cartel for punishing people for defecting from the cartel, right? So the goal of the cartel is to ensure a credible punishment of the cheaters, and the goal of the agency is to catch the people who are forming the cartel and to prevent them from punishing people who defect, right? And Stigler's theory of oligopoly is all based on the dynamics of this back and forth, right? So in order for the cartel to deter cheating, Kentaro, what does it have to be able to do? To stop people from breaking the cartel agreement.
Okay.
To have an effective cartel, what do you have to do?
So you need to monitor.
Yeah. That's a key point, right? I mean, you first have to be able to figure out what your agreement is in the first place, right? And that can be difficult for all the reasons that externality problems were difficult earlier, because it needs to know what the externalities are. It needs to figure out what the optimal level of production is. And if different firms have different production costs, know a different thing about demand conditions, that may be hard to do, especially without communication, right? And the more the government is breathing down your neck, the harder it is for companies to do that, right? They have to have a clear notion of what does and does not constitute cheating on the cartel, right? So it doesn't make sense to have a really, really rigid cartel rule which says if you don't produce exactly the amount that we agreed on, we're going to just completely break up the cartel, right? Because that doesn't give any firms any flexibility that if like someone comes to them and is like, I absolutely need more quantity this month and I'll pay you an arbitrary amount for it, that they couldn't do that, right? If the rules of the cartel are too rigid, it's going to fall apart really quickly. So you have to allow some flexibility in the same way that we talked about in the centralization versus decentralization thing. You have to give some delegation, but then you also have to have some control, right? But if you have too much flexibility, then everyone can always make it look like they were just doing something because the market forced them to, and you'll never be able to stop people from cheating on the cartel, right? The cartel has to be able to detect cheating and to distinguish it from the background noise, right? So many things might look like cheating, but actually be innocent. It might look like the other firm is selling more goods when in reality all that happened was that there was a big increase in the demand for that firm's products that month, right? You have to have a cost-effective means of punishing the people, because ideally you would do it through taxation and redistribution, because that would be like a Pigouvian efficient transfer, right? But that may be very difficult to do, and so you might have to use a more inefficient means of punishing them, right? That will obviously make it harder, as we studied when we talked about criminal justice, and force the firms to only apply the punishment in cases where that's likely to actually be deterring the cheating. One way you can more efficiently redistribute is to shift market shares across firms. So if one firm sells more this month, then the next month you might say that their quota goes down, and then the other firms could go up if they can't literally make payments between each other. On the other hand, price wars, when if someone cheats, everyone lowers their price, are a much less efficient means of punishment, right? Because that hurts all the members of the cartel, not just the one who cheated, right? And you have to be able to do all this quickly, right? So you don't want to wait forever.